Hi, I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental topics that green up our world. Today we're continuing our series on art that is inspired by nature. We have two guests for this show, a musical composer and a dance choreographer. Our first guest is Jessica Fogel, who joined the University of Michigan Dance Department in 1985, where she is a professor of dance and artistic director of Ann Arbor Dance Works, the resident professional dance company of the University of Michigan. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here.
So glad you could come. I've always enjoyed dance, and I, of course, am very interested in nature, but I've never combined the two in my mind, and you do so beautifully in so many of your works, and we're going to be talking about those today. I'd like to start out by reading a quote from your introduction to one of your projects, which was called Corsets, Grains, and Greenways, and you said, "If we dance it, it just might come." What were you referring to then?
Well, this was a complex project that took place along a 4-block route in downtown Ann Arbor this past June. And we partnered with several community groups, including the Allen Creek Greenway Conservancy. And they have envisioned a part of the downtown area where we were performing as a future greenway and anchor park along the railroad tracks by West Liberty, actually bridging the athletic complex to the Argo Dam along a 7-mile route. But in the center of downtown, they've envisioned an anchor park that will be a site of public gatherings, public art, festivities, and it's right now a kind of forsaken parking lot called 415 West Washington, and an abandoned building, and a fairly unsightly place to perform. So I decided to end this 90-minute performance in the parking lot with a finale where the audience gathered and saw the 15 dancers and 25 singers performing in the gravel and dirt amongst cars and imagining what might be there. And we had huge yards of green fabric that we were dancing with. It was called Greening the Way. And the idea was that if we bring the audience into this place and give them a way of imagining what might happen there, it just kind of triggers a little more activity and thinking toward that goal.
Yeah, I have been reading about this greenway quite a bit, but I've never actually really walked around the different parcels of land that they're thinking of putting it in, and I bet a lot of the people in your audience never had either. So
yeah, they hadn't heard of it. Many of them, even if they live right here in Ann Arbor, had not heard about it really. It's in the paper, and the Conservancy, of course, is promoting it, but in a certain way, a lot of people did not have an awareness of it. And I think it's very different to read about it in the newspaper compared to actually being in the space or walking and seeing how close it is from Main Street to this greenway that would connect outlying neighborhoods to the vibrant downtown. So it's a really exciting prospect. And I think people who have been to New York City and seen the High Line transformed, an elevated railroad, can compare it to that.
Which is a super exciting thing for
I love
New
it
York.
there, yeah. And so that's the vision on a low-lying ground for Ann Arbor.
Another advocacy project you're thinking about is during your sabbatical year that's coming up. You were talking about perhaps bringing attention to the offshore wind turbines through dance, which sounds like a really exciting project.
Yeah, you know, I have not yet embarked on that. I've just begun to propose the idea, and I have a sabbatical coming up in winter 2014. And I imagine doing a project along the shores, the western shores of Lake Michigan, where in the Muskegon area they're planning to do some offshore, or hoping to do some offshore wind turbines. And there's a lot of controversy about this kind of clean energy. Even people who are for it don't really want it in their backyards, as it were. And they have legitimate concerns, but I'm trying to envision a way that one might rethink and re-envision that form of energy as something quite beautiful and something that even tourists might want to come and see as something to go see, an attraction really, rather than a blight.
When I was reading about your work, I came across the phrase sight dance, which is something that I'm not used to, but apparently that is when you're not on a stage in an indoor area. And a lot of your work, such as at Nichols Arboretum and the Matai Botanical Gardens, do you want to tell us about those projects?
Yeah, I mean, sight dance really means an alternative space instead of in a traditional theater setting, although even a theater setting is a site. It's all sight. Okay. But yeah, about back in 2002, about 10 years ago, a woman who was working in development at Nichols Arboretum commissioned several arts projects to take place, and one of them was called Heath Celebration, the Restoration of a Glen, and it was to celebrate the years of work on this particular part of the Arboretum called the Heathdale Glen. It had been called the Appalachian Glen. And so there was a wonderful performance that took place with dancers and musicians, and the audience followed us through this deeply wooded and valley terrain, watching dance and hearing music along the way. So a dancer began with a solo down a steep serpentine path, and then you came along a duet that took place along this huge fallen log. The audience would go a little bit further and find a solo tucked deep into the woods far away, and then come a little further down to the bottom of the glen and see dancers descending a steep hilltop. So a lot of places, it brought the place alive through movement and sound.
Must have been beautiful.
It was a beautiful place to work,
yeah.
And it was. It happened on an early weekend in June, the first really warm nights after a really cold, nasty, rainy May, and people came out of the woodwork, and it was quite a magical time, and I got very excited about. I had done a lot of sight dance work as a dancer coming of age in New York at a time when a lot of dances were happening on the streets, on rooftops, in ponds. But this project in the Arboretum brought me back to that kind of work and got me very excited about it again.
Great. A lot of your work is very collaborative with different multidisciplinary artists. And for instance, the Mapping the River project, which has been the inspiration for this particular series on CTN, that we've interviewed Sarah Adlerstein, the visual artist. We'll be interviewing Keith Taylor, the poet. In a few minutes, we have Evan Chambers, the musical composer, and also there were videographers, sound designers, all kinds of different artists. How do you like working with a collaborative team on portraying these environmental issues?
Well, dance is always a very collaborative enterprise, almost always. I'm often working with a composer or musician, or with text, with a stage crew. It's not a solitary endeavor. But this was a project in which we all had really equal input. And that was quite a calibration and negotiation and process, with a lot of pushing and pulling in order to really give it a shape and a form. And as soon as we thought of the topic of the river and the cycle of water as a way of processing it, we began to be able to feed in Keith's beautiful poems. I think Evan already had written Headwaters or was working on that at the time. And I created choreography based upon these and the stories of the river that Sarah was really bringing to the process. And her story of the demise of the mussels became the heart of the narrative. It was a really exciting project because you know, it brought so many different perspectives and so many different dimensions to it. We had wonderful water percussion with Joseph Gramley's percussion ensemble, very exciting sound and visually.
The clip we're going to show isn't actually representational of the dance choreography in that it's kind of subdued, the part we're going to show, but I love that because it's portraying the headwaters, and when we visited the headwaters of the Mississippi years ago, I was expecting something grand, you know, like the rapids, but I realized that it's just the gathering of moisture, and you'll see these dancers, how they're very, you know, subdued, and it's really quite lovely. I love how you portrayed that. We're going to show that clip, but first we're going to say goodbye to you. Thank you so much for being here today. It's been really interesting. And what is your website where people can find out more about your work?
It's jessicafogel.com.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara.
We'll show that clip now.
Headwaters here don't spring up. They seep out between horizons of gravel and clay. Black soil glistens more like slime than dirt before the improbable silent drop into the first puddle. A hint of current almost hidden beneath the long grasses. Not a stream yet, but a suggestion of river.
Evan, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about the clip, but first I need to introduce you properly. You're the chair of the composition department at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance, which I'm sure keeps you really busy, but apparently you still have time for composing because your orchestral song cycle, The Old Burying Ground, was performed at Carnegie Hall and is available on compact disc and iTunes. And you're also a musician, right?
Yes, I'm a composer and a traditional fiddler. I play the fiddle for fun, and I've been an avid practitioner of that for many years.
I read that you were a fiddle soloist with the American Composers Orchestra in Carnegie Hall.
I was.
Was
It
that for the
great
old
fun.
burying ground?
No, there's a piece I wrote called Concerto for Fiddle and Violin.
Oh, okay.
And the American Composers Orchestra is an interesting group. They're very interested in having composers perform their own pieces.
Oh, okay.
So I was invited under those auspices. I would otherwise not be performing in Carnegie Hall usually. But it was a great,
Must've been great.
great occasion, yeah.
So about the clip, how was, I know you live near the river, the Huron River, right? And how was the river inspirational to you for this project, Mapping the River?
Well, I live just uphill from the river, and since I moved to Ann Arbor in I moved here in '86, but since 1990 I've lived within sight of the Huron River. And I go visit it every day. I mean, I go look at it and walk along it every day. So, I mean, it's not so much that the river inspired the piece as much as it inhabited my music. Since I spend so much time there, it became a natural thing for me to want to incorporate my own experiences into a form that I can attempt to take my 10 minutes of FaceTime with an audience, or in this case, half an hour, 45 minutes of FaceTime, I guess it was an hour long in its presentation. Spend that FaceTime with an audience to try to bring their attention to the natural world, even though this particular piece is done in a sound studio with fancy lighting and video and lots of technology. We're still inviting people into this closed performance space and hoping to open everyone's experience out to the world that surrounds us.
When we were talking earlier, you told me this lovely little anecdote about going to the headwaters with Keith Taylor, the poet. Can you describe what that was like?
Well, it was a really wonderful morning for me. Keith Taylor and I went up to the headwaters of the Huron River, and I've often said it's like entering a church. There's a golf course. It's a metro park, but there's a golf course there and parking lots, and then you walk through the area of scrub trees and weeds and busy with invasive species and birds twittering from the area of the field that's growing back to forest into this swamp area. It's not, the Huron River doesn't just spring out as one stream and then rush fully formed towards Lake Erie. It starts in this area that's all swampy, and because of that, it's not been developed. So you're walking into this space of darkness and old trees, these grand old presences, and quiet. And it's colder in there. And I really had this sense of hush, and it was as if I was entering a temple. And that experience really found its way into the content of the music, because the headwaters are really just little disorganized pools of water, each one with its own temperature and its own acidity and its own vibration rate. And only very gradually do you begin to see, oh, this is little tiny trickle over here, and there's a larger flow gathering over there, and by walking through it gradually comes together and organizes itself into a tiny stream, and then a sort of a marshy pool, and from there the stream of the Huron begins.
And did that structure sort of help you form the structure of the musical piece?
Well, yes. In that, I actually tried to map that experience into the form of the music. So, at the beginning, the piece actually starts with the sound of a red-winged blackbird tweeting. Oh,
and did I tell you, I actually got a sound file and put it in front of, I want to have the audience hear that, because when you told me that, I was amazed, and so I couldn't help but go to the internet and grab the sound file. So we're going to play that right now. It's only 10 seconds. We're going to show that now. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I thought that was really lovely. I couldn't resist.
Well, thanks. Yeah, so I took the sound. I mean, red-winged blackbirds love marshy places, right? So they're all around the headwaters. You're bound to hear that song, especially in the spring when they're coming back. Yeah. So I took that sound of the recording of the bird and scored it out for the instruments as kind of an entry point. And from there, structurally, the music follows sort of the shape of that I described earlier. There are these tiny pools of activity that flutter and vibrate and with connective tissue to other areas until gradually the piece turns into a larger flow later on.
Well, it works really well. I just really love it. And I can really feel your connection to the river. And I noticed that on your blog, you had a photo of something really cool that you did. We're going to show a picture of it. It's you titled the blog Mandala, which I didn't know what that was. But apparently in the internet it says that that's a cosmic diagram that reminds us of our relation to the infinite, the world that extends both beyond and within our bodies and minds. Which apparently you had shoveled this thing on the ice on Argo Pond, and it reminded me so much of your music. Everything flows, the verses. Can you help us make that connection?
Sure. Well, 2 years ago, you know, we had a very cold January, and I spent some time, a good colleague and friend of mine, Carmen Pelton, who's a wonderful soprano, loaned us a book, my wife and I, a book about labyrinths and how to construct them, and I became a little bit obsessed with this. And just seemed like the perfect time to create. It's a classic 7-course Minoan Labyrinth, if you know your mythology.
No.
The story of the Minotaur and the labyrinth in Greek mythology is related to this. But it also forms, in the visual terms, a mandala. It's a circular form that's a path to be walked through. They're often used for meditation practice, and even I think the cathedral at Chartres has a famous labyrinth that you walk through as a meditative practice. And I love your definition that you've shared, because in a way that circular form, you know, it fits very well with the idea of cycles, the water cycle and cycles of life and the ways in which we're all connected. The song that you mentioned, Everything Flows, is I wrote for a later production of the Mapping the River piece. I wrote 2 songs that I would just sing by myself. One was called Where is the River, which was inspired by the Huron River Watershed Council ad that said, "Where's the river? Closer than you think." And I started thinking about that, and I thought, well, where's the river? It's closer than you think. It's right in your veins. We literally have, if you live in the Huron River Watershed, it is flowing in our bodies. It is the substance of our blood. It's beneath our feet. It's everywhere around us. It's above us when it rains. It's below us in the form of the groundwater, and it's touching us everywhere. So that immanence and that sense of sacredness really informed a lot of this work.
And on your blog you wrote, "I have the simple hope that if we come to love the river, we will not hurt it, since we are dependent on it utterly." And I know that you've done a little advocacy work at the School of Music trying to keep the landscaping from using pesticides and fertilizers by the pond. So it's pretty neat that you're actually practicing what you preach and combining all these things, both musically, spiritually, and in your practice. It's great.
Thanks.
So if you would like to hear Evan singing the song Everything Flows, you can go to your website, what is your website again?
It's evanchambers.net.
Okay. And it's very lovely. I love your voice. I've heard you sing around town, different performances, and your voice reminds me a little of, I used to live in Appalachia, and that mountain songs, mountain music.
That's interesting.
I feel like I'm there in the mountains when I hear you sing. It's really
my
lovely.
parents were both great lovers of hiking in the woods, and they were 1950s folk revivalists, so that's probably not a surprise in some way.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you.
You'll find links relevant to today's show at ewashington.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.